Space, the final frontier. For humanity and game developers both, apparently. Since the earliest days of gaming, space has been intimately tied to its evolution. And while various space-related genres have rose and fell over the years, the concept of exploring the stars has always remained as a lasting dream for developers and players alike. In fact, few ideas in gaming seem to be responsible for as much excitement and disappointment as space exploration. This idea created the most expensive video game in history, and the largest crowdfunding project of all time, as well as one of gaming's most infamous disappointments and one of its most famous redemption stories, as well as some of the biggest games ever made, some of the most ambitious projects ever conceived, and more recently, Starfield, a game made by Bethesda that has created an awful lot of discussion around space exploration. Yes, the appeal of this concept clearly runs deep, and it's not hard to understand why. People want to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, and to boldly go where no one has gone before. And video games are one of the only mediums where that's actually possible. But dreams are one thing, reality is often quite different. So I want to look at how various games have handled space exploration over the years, and at how close modern games have come to achieving this dream. Because space is captivating, but it's also challenging, for humanity and game developers both, apparently. Still, first, let's set the stage, and look at where this idea came from. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. And in April 1962, Space War by Steve Russell became the first ever video game to be created for non-academic purposes. And so, when it comes to space, where humans went, video games soon followed. By the end of the decade, humanity had come a long way, as in July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to step foot on the moon. To this day, only 10 more people have followed in their footsteps, with the most recent being in 1972, which doesn't feel particularly recent anymore. Once upon a time, the moon seemed to be within walking distance, but times have changed, and space still feels remarkably far away. In fairness, humanity has made many notable achievements since the original moon landing, but it doesn't always feel that way, and for most people, space is as distant as it ever has been, with humanity's space exploration seeming to peak in 1969, and never going much further. For video games, however, this was not the case. In 1969, the industry was still waiting to be established, and as soon as it was, space was everywhere. 1971 saw the release of the first two arcade video games, Computer Space and Galaxy Game, both following on very directly from the earlier Space War to create multiplayer space combat games. The success of 1972's more abstract Pong and other games it inspired did create a brief respite from gaming space domination, but this didn't last long, as soon the golden age of arcades got underway with numerous massively successful space-themed games like Space Invaders, Asteroids, Galaga, and more. And it wasn't just arcades, as space was leaving its mark on early PC games too, in text-based titles like 1971's Star Trek and 1974's Star Trader. In this period, space and video games seemed to be a match made in heaven, as both tapped into excitement surrounding technology and the future, while the electronic display of gaming devices lent themselves perfectly to space aesthetics, and the still recent moon landing remained at the forefront of the public's imagination. And it didn't take long for space to move from being a setting to something more, with 1980's space combat sim Star Raiders from Atari, and 1983's flight sim Space Shuttle: A Journey into Space from Activision, both representing more serious, simulation-based attempts at creating space games. Still, it was 1984 when things truly changed, with the arrival of Elite, from then students David Braben and Ian Bell. Elite was an open-ended space trading and combat sim, and its achievements are numerous. It was one of the first games to combine wireframe 3D graphics with hidden line removal to accurately depict objects in 3D. It used advanced procedural generation to create a game world of staggering size and complexity, featuring 8 distinct galaxies, each with 256 planets to visit. And it's cited as being one of the very first open-world games, and offered an almost unprecedented level of freedom in where to go and what to do. Most important of all, though, might be that Elite wasn't just a game that was about space, or which was set in space. It was the game that first made space exploration a reality. During its development, the decision was made to forego many of the features players once used to expect in games, like high scores, live systems, or even set objectives for players, to instead create an experience that would feel more realistic and would rely on players' own desire to explore what was possible in its simulated universe. And, as it turned out, what was possible was quite a lot, including trading goods, space combat and bounty hunting, exploring new star systems and space stations, piracy, asteroid mining, and more. As a result of this groundbreakingly ambitious scope, Elite may well be the most seminal space game ever made, having a significant influence on many of the games that would follow in its footsteps, and showing just how much could be achieved by the genre. And many games did follow in its footsteps. Starflight, Space Rogue, Star Control, and Lightspeed are just a handful of examples, and by the start of the 90s, space sims were going strong, and had evolved into 3 distinct subgenres. Space combat games, perhaps best exemplified by Origin Systems' visually striking and highly successful Wing Commander in 1990. Space flight sims, the most forgotten yet most realistic of the 3. And space trading and combat sims, sometimes just referred to as space sims, which followed on from Elite and often placed heavy emphasis on freedom and exploration as core parts of their design. 1993 would see 2 such important games, with Wing Commander Privateer, a spin-off of the now flourishing Wing Commander series, which created a less combat-focused and more open experience, yet still retained a lot of Wing Commander's visual flair, and Frontier Elite 2 from David Braben, which retained Elite's impressive scale and expanded on its open-ended design by adding the ability to land on planets, as well as more realistic Newtonian physics and galaxy modelling. Both games were well received, but as the decade continued, not everything would be smooth sailing for the genre. The success of Wing Commander and other combat-focused games led to oversaturation by the mid-90s. Newly emerging genres like first-person shooters and real-time strategy games were creating more competition on PC, and sequels to prominent space sims seemed to be struggling to reach the same heights as their predecessors, with both Elite's third entry, Frontier First Encounter in 1995, and Privateer 2 The Darkening in 1996, getting mixed receptions, in part because of bugs and over-ambitious design. By the end of the decade, space games were truly in decline, which was perhaps best exemplified by Free Space 2, a Game of the Year winning space combat game which received glowing reviews, has maintained a passionate fanbase to this day, and is considered by many to be one of the best space games ever made, that still saw abysmal sales from a public that didn't seem to care that much about space games anymore. This was partly blamed on the need for a joystick, something that was once a common requirement for space games, but which might have accelerated their decline, because as soon as people stopped buying joysticks, they stopped buying any games that needed them. Still, hope was not lost for the genre, because as a new millennium rolled around, one game stood above all others in generating hype and representing a brighter future. It's at this point that we need to introduce a man whose name is more synonymous with space games than anyone else's, but who is also a figure of some controversy. Chris Roberts was the lead designer and director of the original Wing Commander, and he would play a major role in most future Wing Commander games, including Privateer. After leaving Origin Systems in 1996, Roberts would found his own studio and continue to create space games, the most ambitious being Freelancer, the game Roberts had always dreamed of making, which would bring the space sim genre into a new generation by retaining the scale and freedom, yet combining this with cutting-edge presentation and multiplayer in a persistent world that would be continually influenced by the actions of thousands of players in a way never seen before. This was ambitious, and after development started in 1997, the project would see numerous delays, leading to financial troubles that culminated in Microsoft buying the studio and significantly dialing back the ambition, with Roberts leaving the project entirely. The end result released in 2003, years after its initial launch target, and yet, dialed back or not, Freelancer was still an impressive game that would end up as somewhat of a swan song for the space sim genre. Unlike many games of the previous decade, Freelancer was designed from the outset with mouse and keyboard in mind, ensuring smooth and intuitive controls that were accessible to new players. It also retained the open-ended nature of the genre while delivering in its presentation, with full voice acting, great space visuals, lots of interesting locations to visit, and a heavy emphasis on story, all combining to create a big-budget space blockbuster of a kind rarely seen in this era. Alas, as good as it might have been, Freelancer still couldn't save the genre alone, and with PC gaming entering into a period of decline as the 2000s continued, with many developers focusing more on console games and console-focused genres, space sims were forced to enter into a lengthy period of hibernation. But while the concept of space exploration might have started with the space sim genre, it wasn't exclusive to it, and it didn't die alongside it. For starters, space proved to be one of the most popular settings for strategy games, both real-time and turn-based, with examples like Masters of Orion, Homeworld, Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, and Galactic Civilizations, allowing for different styles of space combat and colonization that were often less tied to realism and so were more flavorful than the space sim genre. Meanwhile, BioWare's 2003 RPG Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic brought the fantasy of space to console players, featuring 8 planets to traverse and a heavy focus on story and world building, which did much to bring the popular Star Wars setting to life. This wasn't the only notable Star Wars game of that year, however, as 2003 also saw the release of the MMO Star Wars Galaxies, which featured a large game world with a large amount of player freedom to provide an entirely new space experience. Galaxies included many non-combat focused professions alongside an in-depth player housing system, complete with player-created and run cities, shops and cantinas, all in a persistent universe filled with real inhabitants, and this massively multiplayer online design tapped into another side of the space exploration fantasy. Traversing the stars, engaging in dogfights, and discovering planets are all exciting, but sometimes so is the mundane. At least it is if the world feels alive, which the increased scale and multiplayer nature of MMOs helped to accomplish. And speaking of MMOs, 2003 would also see perhaps history's most enduring space game by way of EVE Online, a space-based MMO that combined aspects of the space sim genre, particularly the focus on openness and the familiar range of space-based activities, with aspects of the MMO genre, like a persistent world, multiplayer focus, and player-versus-player conflict. EVE is unique even amongst other MMOs though, as rather than using a number of servers to divide its player base into more manageable populations like most older MMOs, or using instance-based technology like most modern MMOs, EVE instead featured only a single shared world for the entirety of its player base. This created an unprecedented sense of scale that would give rise to massive conflicts and alliances, as well as a shared history of the player base's actions and accomplishments. EVE's biggest battles have their own Wikipedia pages, complete with details like the commanders involved or number of casualties, and they can include thousands of participants fighting across many hours and causing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of ship losses. When you zoom in and look at what players actually do in-game, EVE might be considered less of a space sim than many of the games which came before it, as things like controlling your ship are far more basic. But zoom out, and EVE provides a simulation of a living, changing galaxy full of complexity and lasting consequence, fulfilling a core part of Chris Roberts' dream that hadn't ultimately come to fruition with Freelancer. The 2000s would see few other notable space games, although the well-received 2007 RPG Mass Effect would see BioWare returning to a space-based setting, which this time featured a large range of uncharted planetary systems for players to travel to and scan, with many being traversable on foot or vehicle. This created a heavier focus on exploration than many RPGs before it, although poor vehicle controls and repetition in side content also meant this ended up as one of the most criticized parts of the game, leading to this more free-roam style of exploration being removed from the next two games in the trilogy. Other MMOs would lead to the creation of several more massively multiplayer space worlds, but really, the first decade of the 2000s would end on a quiet note for space exploration, with players' dreams of exploring virtual stars starting to seem a thing of the past, much like humanity's own hopes of traversing the solar system. In the end though, this didn't last, and when space was ready to make its comeback, it did so in explosive fashion. Space sims never died out completely. A small number of titles would see modest success amongst niche audiences, and the X series, which started in 1999 and represents a classically complex take on the genre, would see multiple entries throughout the 2000s and is still going strong to this day. Still, by the start of the 2010s, if the genre wasn't dead, it did seem to be on life support, and with it, so seemed the dream of space exploration, until the arrival of digital distribution, indie gaming, and crowdfunding, which changed everything. Digital distribution cut production and retail costs while ensuring that niche titles could still find their target audience. The growth of indie gaming led to more diversity in the industry while lowering the barrier of entry and risk involved in development, and crowdfunding proved just how much the dream of space exploration still meant to people. The combined result of all this was a bit of a space renaissance. Old genres returned, with Kerbal Space Program leading the charge with its early access release in 2011 to provide an accessible yet deep space flight simulator that would introduce many new players to the genre, and space combat games would soon follow, with several new hits including Rebel Galaxy, Everspace, and the impressively big budget Star Wars Squadrons. Still, indie growth didn't just mean the return of old, as many new games also meant entirely new ways to explore space. Faster Than Light combined elements of space simulation with roguelike random generation and permadeath to depict space as a challenge to overcome. Star Sector created a top-down open-world space sandbox that retained much of the freedom of classic space sims with a less simulation-focused style. The success of Minecraft and Terraria would lead to a number of survival and/or building-focused space games, including the 2D side-scrolling Starbound, the engineering and construction-focused Space Engineers, and the block-based Evorion, with many of these games also adopting a sandbox approach where exploring their procedurally generated worlds was a major focus. Meanwhile, 2019's Outer Wilds turned the concept of space exploration on its head by creating a time loop adventure game set in an impressively simulated solar system that was shrunk down to a more manageable single-player scale. Outer Wilds might not have been a game about space exploration in the traditional sense, but it was a game about exploration and space, and its hands-off approach, where players were given almost no direction as they uncovered the game's mysteries entirely on their own, created a truer sense of exploration than almost any other game, space or otherwise, ever has. In a similar vein, games like Exo 1 focused on space exploration as a more emotionally evocative experience, while games like Hard Space Shipbreaker followed Outer Wilds' approach of zooming in, this time with a more simulation-heavy approach to salvaging ships and earning an honest living. And there are more indie games that could be mentioned than this. By this point, space exploration could be seen as quite a vague and general concept that can be applied in many different contexts, to the point where making a YouTube video focused on this concept might seem overly broad and foolish. And I would agree with that if it wasn't for the existence of several prominent modern games that embody the dream of space exploration more than any others. And it's here that things start to get interesting. Because the 2010s didn't just see the rise of indie gaming, it also saw a surge in crowdfunding, particularly on Kickstarter in the first half of the decade, where one game made a very big splash. No name is more synonymous with space games than Chris Roberts, and in 2012 he would announce his first new game since his involvement with Freelancer, alongside a Kickstarter campaign that promised a classic space sim with everything that made Wing Commander, Privateer and Freelancer special, alongside a few other things, like large-scale multiplayer in a persistent universe, with hundreds of different star systems and deep simulation, as well as a separate yet connected single-player campaign, celebrity voice acting, user-generated content, 10 times the detail of current AAA games, virtual reality support, and so on. To back these promises up was an impressive sizzle reel of a self-funded prototype of the game, as well as the man himself. Star Citizen was everything the Kickstarter movement was about. Well-known industry names with big promises centered on old yet still loved franchises and genres, and lots of blame placed on those unneeded traditional publishers. The project reached its $500,000 goal in just 6 days, while doing much to help put Kickstarter on the map for gamers in the process, with the total raised going on to exceed $6 million by the time its 1-month campaign was over. The message this delivered was clear. Space sims might not be back quite yet, but many people wish they were, and plenty were willing to put their money where their mouth is. Following the success of Star Citizen, a Kickstarter was launched by David Braben and his studio Frontier Developments for a sequel to legendary space sim series Elite. This campaign raised less money over a longer period, but it still succeeded at meeting its goal, and unlike Star Citizen, it would only take 2 years for its promises to become reality, with a finished game releasing to positive reviews at the end of 2014. Elite Dangerous was the classic space sim with modern graphics that many people had been waiting for, and it saw strong sales and further development in the following years, by which point another space game was starting to dominate public attention. No Man's Sky was an indie game, but you'd be forgiven for thinking otherwise. Despite being created by a small team of just 13 developers, it generated a huge amount of press coverage and hype following its public showings leading up to its release, with Sony even prominently showcasing the game center stage at E3, in a first for an independently developed video game. No Man's Sky was focused entirely around space exploration, and its premise was ambitious, with seamless travel between planets and systems in a procedurally generated universe of over 18 quintillion planets. I had to look up what exactly a quintillion was just now. That's how big a number we're talking about here. It's pretty big. No Man's Sky would take much inspiration from the space sims of old, particularly in its use of procedural generation and player freedom, and yet in gameplay it took more from the then still new survival genre, with an emphasis on resource gathering and progression. In the end, No Man's Sky would release in summer 2016, to a memorably mixed reception. Meanwhile, speculation over Star Citizen's lack of a release started to draw plenty of mixed attention of its own, while Elite and No Man's Sky both evolved considerably through post-release updates, until a final major player entered into the space exploration arena after Bethesda, the maker of popular RPG series The Elder Scrolls and Fallout, announced that their first new IP in 25 years would be a space exploration-based RPG named Starfield. Fast forward to today, and speculation is still ongoing over Star Citizen's failure to release, but Starfield on the other hand has arrived, meaning there are now 3 big and ambitious space games that have promised to deliver on that enduring dream of exploring space. All 3 games have colourful histories, are massive in scale, make heavy use of procedural generation, feature similar features of space travel, space combat, and planet traversal, and all 3 once generated a lot of hype, and might also have been responsible for a substantial amount of disappointment. And yet, despite these similarities, all 3 games are often remarkably different, in large part because each one comes from a different genre. Elite Dangerous is a space sim through and through. No Man's Sky is very much a survival game, and Starfield is an open-world RPG. As a result, while all 3 games might share the same dream, the way in which they try to achieve it, and what exploration actually means in each game, is completely different, and these differences ultimately reveal a lot about why space exploration is such an intriguing yet challenging concept for video games. So, let's talk about the big 3, starting with the most recent. Bethesda might be new to space, but they have plenty of experience at creating large open worlds. Few modern games have had as large an influence as 2011's Skyrim, and few RPG series have come close to matching the popularity of The Elder Scrolls or Fallout. And so, leading up to its release, expectations for Starfield were understandably high, although fan reaction has seemed more mixed since. Still, much of Bethesda's well-established RPG formula has been successfully transplanted into Starfield's new space setting, and Fallout 4 in space is hardly the worst description of what this game is actually like. A few hours into the experience, you'll soon be inundated with a vast range of side quests, while much of your time is spent shooting enemies, collecting loot, and picking up different unneeded objects, often as you move through distinct dungeon-like locations to complete quests and gain money and experience points. For many, this is familiar stuff, and there's a sense that Bethesda took an if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach to Starfield's core design, in the hopes that repeating what worked before would work again, in spite of any differences created by the setting. That said, there does seem to have been some attempts to improve on past games' more criticized areas, in particular the depth of RPG mechanics, which many saw as reaching a new low with Fallout 4. To this end, the protagonist is no longer voiced, dialogue choices are less restrictive as they no longer follow the same rigid formula, more quests seem to involve elements of player choice, the level up system leans more into encouraging specialization, with several important features being initially locked off entirely without investment, and so on. The net result of all this is not huge, but it is noticeable. Starfield also introduces some new systems into the mix, like the impressively in-depth shipbuilding, or the more substantial role of companions who now also act as crew on your ship. For all these similarities and improvements, however, there is still one substantial difference between Starfield and past Bethesda games, which is that its open world is a lot less open this time round. Space is vast, and Starfield features over 1,000 planets, meaning its various in-game activities are dotted around its galaxy, rather than all being contained on a single seamless map, with travelling between these activities now being mostly done through menus. Fast travel was a big part of past Bethesda games too, but its role is even larger this time round, as it's the only way to navigate much of this world, ensuring a lot of time is spent in the game's somewhat clunky menus or waiting on load screens. Some space games do allow seamless travel from one planet's surface to another, but Starfield shows little interest in space travel in the first place, with the player's ship instead existing to act as a sort of mobile house, as well as to facilitate its rather basic ship combat. For a space sim, this would be sacrilegious, but a space sim Starfield is not, as is soon made obvious by the fact that the ship UI is simply overlaid on top of its in-game visuals, rather than being incorporated into its design. Still, even for those not expecting Starfield to incorporate space sim elements into Bethesda's classic RPG design, its heavy reliance on menus and fast travel still comes across as surprisingly disjointed for an open-world game. Starfield also struggles with portraying its vast scale in an immersive and believable way. One of the easiest ways to increase immersion in games is to zoom in, as the less you try to portray, the more realistic that portrayal often is. Depicting a believable sense of scale is something even past Bethesda games have struggled with, as can be seen with how frequently Skyrim has been criticized for its unrealistically small capital cities that contain only a handful of buildings. Instead of zooming in, however, Starfield zooms even further out, forcing it to rely heavily on procedural generation to populate its vast in-game galaxy. Procedural generation seems to be viewed quite negatively within gaming at this current moment in time, but it's worth considering that it does have many positives, and many games have benefited from it over the years. It's what the roguelike genre is built upon, it's what made Minecraft the most successful video game of all time, and it was a massive part of the original Elite, meaning it has a long-established precedent in space-based games. Procedural generation isn't inherently bad. It's a tool like anything else, and what matters is how it's used. When it comes to immersion, however, the more noticeable procedural generated elements are, the less immersive they often become, as it makes the world feel more artificial. When something is handcrafted, we know that it was important to someone, and that there was some kind of artistic vision behind it where decisions were made for specific reasons. But with procedural generation, this isn't the case anymore, and it can make things feel less real and somewhat meaningless as a result. Compared to some games, Starfield's procedurally generated planet surfaces and locations might seem quite impressive, and they certainly look the part, with both interior and exterior locations often being stylish, authentic, and suitably spacey. But I don't think most people will compare Starfield to other procedurally generated games. Instead, they'll most likely compare it to Skyrim or Fallout 4, and the result is that its procedural generation starts to feel quite noticeable. Land on any one of Starfield's 1,000 plus planets, and no matter where you choose to go, you'll find a handful of locations conveniently placed nearby. Explore several planets this way and you'll soon start to find those locations repeating, with you possibly even seeing the exact same caves or fungal growths. You would think that some planets might be a lot emptier than others, particularly as the few cities that exist within this universe are rather small, suggesting humanity's reach is quite limited. And yet, no matter which planet you go to, or where you choose to land, various human-created outposts never seem too far off. A lot of flora and fauna seem quite similar to each other too, and really, the more you explore this way, the more noticeable the procedural generation becomes, and the less believable the world feels as a result. The new exploration-based activity of surveying also seems poorly designed and offers little reward, with the need to scan multiple copies of each plant or animal just feeling like uninteresting busywork. What's more, in past Bethesda games, this type of natural exploration seemed to be encouraged, with landscapes that are designed to draw players in and make them want to find out what's over the horizon or what story might be connected to a certain location. In Starfield, however, that doesn't really happen, as deep down you always know that what's over the horizon is just another procedurally generated location that has no more theoretical value than any other procedurally generated location you could see instead. As a result of all this, you could say Starfield is the least exploration-based Bethesda RPG, and it does do that traditional get out into the world, go wherever you want, and find some interesting content style of gameplay worse than past Bethesda games. But this is, in many ways, the result of the setting. If Starfield had one planet, instead of 1,000, alongside a more traditional, connected open-world map, it might have been a better game, but it'd also be a game about exploring that one planet, rather than exploring space. And part of what makes space exploration interesting are the differences between planets and the vastness of space. Different stars colouring different skies, different gravity values, different atmospheres, different life forms, different challenges, as well as that feeling of not being sure what's out there, of seeming infinitesimally small by comparison, and that fantasy of travelling the stars into the vast unknown where the possibilities are endless. Maybe Starfield should have kept its ambitions in check. Maybe Bethesda should have stuck to what they know. Maybe space exploration is deep down one big trap, but regardless, I still can't bring myself to blame Starfield for trying, particularly as other games that have attempted space exploration show a lot of the same problems. And if Starfield does fail at that more traditional style of physical exploration, it does still find success in a different way. I think the best way to describe this game is that it's a space adventure simulator. Starfield cares little about the laws of Newtonian physics or space travel logistics, and its many planets act more as backdrops than main attractions, because really, this game is all about telling a vast range of classic sci-fi stories. There is a lot of content in this game, and most players will find their quest logs packed with different leads to pursue, all of which are designed to take you on weird and wacky space adventures that will have players doing all sorts of different things in all sorts of different places. Starfield's setting is neither hugely realistic, nor is it especially exotic or original, but this does provide the writers with a lot of freedom to just throw in whatever pulpy sci-fi trope or concept they feel like to spin their own little self-contained story out of, and some of these stories are a lot of fun. The highlight of this game has to be its 4 faction questlines, which all explore a single classic concept, while getting more time and budget in that exploration than most other quests. And so you infiltrate a group of space pirates, play your hand at high-stakes corporate espionage, uncover the secrets of a mysterious, deadly alien monster, and go on a hard-boiled space western detective story, and overall, these are pretty good, and better than many of the faction questlines seen in previous Bethesda games. Throw in plenty of gorgeous space vistas, and some interesting, hand-crafted locations, as well as some weighty choices in how to resolve these questlines, a bit less combat focus in quest design than is usual for Bethesda, and even some nice rewards, and you have many hours of solid spacefaring content to lose yourself in. The main story feels a bit less successful, particularly in its weak premise and awkward early hours, and Bethesda's characters and writing have long been rather goofy in a way that often undermines more serious moments. But when Starfield isn't taking itself too seriously, it has a lot of fun stories to tell, and I think that is what this game is all about. Starfield explores space through stories, and while the quality of these is mixed, with realism rarely seeming a priority, plenty are still entertaining, and the game certainly doesn't lack quantity. This might not be what some players wanted, and there might be areas that could do with improvement, but as a space adventure simulator, Starfield does have a lot to offer. The downside to this is that the physical process of exploring an open world is less of a focus this time round, and what sense of exploration the gameplay does offer is brought down by procedurally generated content and the heavy emphasis on menus and fast travel. It's also fair to question whether Bethesda's open world design has stagnated. For a long time, Bethesda was ahead of the curve in creating open worlds that were not only visually impressive and vast in scale, but that also went further than others to simulate certain immersive aspects, like by making every object in-game interactable, or in giving every NPC a daily schedule to follow. But open-world games have come a long way since Oblivion, while Bethesda have done little to improve their open-world design outside of visuals, and even in this aspect, they aren't really ahead of the curve anymore. And so it's understandable that some people expected Starfield to represent a new step forward in open-world design, where Bethesda might apply many of the concepts and strengths seen in their previous games on a new, never-before-seen scale as befits the space genre. And Bethesda have not done that. The greater scale of space has ended up bringing a number of sacrifices, and when it comes to immersive open-world space simulation, there are existing games that do it better. Marketers the world over dream of being able to generate as much hype for something as No Man's Sky's original trailers did. For No Man's Sky developer Hello Games, it might have been an accident. Of course, making people interested in your game is the objective of a trailer, but I don't think Hello Games could have ever predicted just how effective those trailers would be, and once the hype train got underway, there was no stopping it. Not before No Man's Sky had actually released, and players the world over discovered that the everything game of their dreams that had promised the world and beyond was actually a low-budget, janky indie game that didn't quite match what was depicted in its trailers. Now, it's not the objective of this video to dwell on who's to blame for this situation, and the negative response to No Man's Sky's release was a bit over the top. That said, while I'm glad Hello Games have redeemed themselves in the world's eyes, and I am a big advocate for forgiving, I do think some things shouldn't be forgotten. No Man's Sky didn't just have a slick and doctored trailer, there were also claims made about the game by its developer that were objectively untrue, such as whether the game had multiplayer.
Will you be able to play with your friends? Yeah.
No Man's Sky did not have any semblance of multiplayer at release.
You could encounter other players.
You know, it is possible, but...
Can you run into other people, other players on the game?
Yes, there is the ability to communicate and work with other people.
No, Sean, no multiplayer. Bad. Anyway, there is something else that's to blame here, which is that the dream of space exploration might have been a little too powerful. Many people want a game that lets them explore space, and then when No Man's Sky vaguely promised to make that dream a reality, it brought too much attention to handle, with Hello Games founder Sean Murray ending up way over his head when promoting the game during development, a time when features might still change, and with players imagining a whole lot more than the game's small development team could realistically provide. In the end, the result for most involved was disappointment, but hype also meant high sales, and instead of opting for the easy way out of taking the money and running, Hello Games instead put their heads down and got straight back to work. No Man's Sky has received numerous substantial updates since its launch, all for free, and with time, many of the features once promised have been added, as well as a whole lot more. The No Man's Sky of today is much more than it was at release, and as a result, the game is now better known for its redemption story than its initial disappointment, and rightfully so. But what do you do in No Man's Sky? The main answer is gathering resources, usually using the mining laser. These resources are then used to power your suit, power your weapons, power your ship, and eventually craft buildings and upgrades, make money, and fuel your warp-driving, galaxy-spanning exploration. As the game begins, you'll find yourself on foot with your ship in need of many repairs, but within an hour, your vessel should be up and running, allowing you to take to the skies and beyond as you seamlessly fly between planets, all with no load screens or break in the player's control, with the only fast travel being your high speed with your interplanetary pulse drive and later your inter-system warp drive. For many people, this seamlessness is exactly what Starfield lacks, and the ease with which you can journey from one planet's surface to another is seriously impressive, even with the copious pop-in. If there is one achievement of No Man's Sky which stands out above all others, it has to be the way in which it takes almost every aspect space games are known for: flight, combat, trading, upgrades, mining, freedom, distance, scale, and most importantly, exploration, and makes all of these accessible. Nothing is overly complex or overly challenging. The barrier to entry and barrier to enjoyment are both set very low, and everything feels cohesive and understandable, regardless of the player's experience with the game or genre. As a result, space exploration, for maybe the first time, is made effortless, and it's available to everyone. And so, players can take to the skies and the stars to explore any one of No Man's Sky's 18 quintillion planets, where the possibilities are endless, literally in a way because of the random generation used to determine each planet's specific characteristics. Seeing this diverse assortment of possibilities is an activity in itself, and No Man's Sky's bright, vibrant aesthetic gives the game a strong sense of style that perfectly evokes alien wonder. Still, with so much freedom in such a big universe, it would be easy to feel lost, and so No Man's Sky accompanies its free-form exploration with a reasonably in-depth story that dives into some of the universe's biggest mysteries, particularly around how things ended up the way they did, and the role of the Sentinels, the game's only real antagonists who act as automated robotic guardians of most planets, preserving the status quo which the player's frequent resource gathering might interfere with. As the story unravels, it ends up being surprisingly meta. It looks at the universe as if it were a simulation, it questions where meaning actually comes from, and it frequently captures the inherent sadness of space, where its vast size can make you feel very small and alone by comparison. Ultimately, the point of the story seems to be to push players to find their own meaning in the universe, which could involve any of the many activities the game has to offer to players within its rich sandbox. But the real achievement of the story might be that it helps complete the accessible approach No Man's Sky wants so much to create. Having so many possibilities in front of you with so little direction is intimidating, maybe even overwhelming, and so the story helps to guide you through the game's earlier hours, giving you direction by providing one objective after another that will introduce you to much of the game's mechanics at a relaxed pace so that you are ready to take over on your own to forge your own path through the galaxy when the time comes. Overall, it's easy to see No Man's Sky as a game that succeeds at what it sets out to do, but as a mostly procedurally generated game, this does mean that it shows some of the same problems as Starfield. There are so many planets and so much to see, but it doesn't take long for planets to start feeling similar, and it takes even less time for many of the points of interest and the components of these planets to start to repeat. Some things do have a huge amount of variety, like colour schemes and animal limb-head-body combinations, but really these things are superficial. Meanwhile, arguably more important features like ancient ruins, inhabited buildings, space stations, crashed ships and so on are all almost identical, right down to the same number of aliens and item placement inside of buildings. This doesn't feel particularly realistic, and nor does it feel very exciting, and knowing that everything is procedurally generated means you know that there's little out there that is truly unique and meaningful, which robs the exploration of some of its magic. That's not to say I haven't seen interesting things when playing this game.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watched sea beams glitter in the dark near the 10-house gate.
I have seen things, but the thing is, I think you would believe all of them, and they are probably quite similar to the things other people have seen as well. Procedural generation has its limits, and sooner or later that becomes obvious. What's more, while some planets do look a little more exciting or aesthetic than others, I still think all of the best looking planets and landscapes I've seen in this game have come from the actual marketing material. This was true at release, and it's remained true in every new trailer that's released since, and journeying through space in this game sometimes has me wishing that I could trade a few quintillion randomly generated planets for a handful of handcrafted ones, just to see what could be possible if a person was the creator rather than an algorithm. In this way, exploration in No Man's Sky and Starfield is remarkably similar. The scale feels endless, the visuals are the most impressive part, and meaning is somewhat lacking due to procedural generation. At least it is once the limits of the procedural generation start to become clear. Starfield tries to make up for this with its many handcrafted stories, while No Man's Sky excels in its seamlessness, its freedom, and its accessibility. But there is still something else that seems to be lacking in both, which is how gamified their galaxies often feel. You could show this with Starfield as well, but I think No Man's Sky's survival gameplay makes it even more obvious. There are a near infinite number of different plants in this game, but the function of almost all of these is just to be broken down into carbon for the player, while most rocks are just there for iron. An entire universe of different plants and rocks lies before you, and all of them have one job only, and that's providing something useful to the player. Meanwhile, almost every planet you go to contains the same evenly dispersed oxygen and sodium-rich plants, because these are what you use to power your suit, and so having them be easily accessible on every planet is convenient. The same can be said for the never too far away asteroids in space that contain tritium, the thing that fuels your ship and could leave you stranded in space if you were to ever run out. And things that don't provide you with basic elements or help with upgrades just seem to exist to be sold for credits. Basically, everything you find is useful, and the things you need are never far away, all to allow for player progression to be constant and player frustration to be minimal. No Man's Sky wants to be accessible, so this design philosophy helps fulfill that objective, but this also makes its world feel incredibly safe and convenient and player-oriented. And when I think of space, and even more so space exploration, safe, convenient, and human-oriented aren't what come to mind. In fact, they might be the exact opposite, and that's a big part of why space exploration seems so interesting. Space represents this monumental challenge that is completely uncaring of human wants and needs, and that is not at all what space is in No Man's Sky or Starfield. But it does apply to another game. Elite Dangerous is a hard game to explain, so to help, I think it might be best if I talk you through my experience with it. I hadn't played Elite Dangerous before this video. In fact, I hadn't played any classic space sim, but Starfield had left a space exploration itch that I wanted to scratch. A similar itch to what No Man's Sky had left a few years earlier, and judging by the hype and subsequent reception of No Man's Sky, and the large amount of exploration-focused discussion surrounding Starfield, I imagined it was an itch that I wasn't alone in having. So, off I went to Elite. After creating your character, the game opens with an on-ground tutorial. The graphics here are quite impressive, and a voice in your ear walks you through everything you need to do, such as opening doors, picking up objects, and killing enemies. All things I, as an experienced video game player, can do quite well. Those doors didn't stand a chance. With this tutorial completed, you're given a ride back to the nearest space station, where you can do a second tutorial focused on space travel and combat that you need to complete to get your pilot's license. This tutorial is a little bit harder, but with a voice in my ear still instructing me what to do and what keybind to press, it was still fairly simple to complete. After this, I was given a license and a ship, and that was it. I was now completely alone in an in-game Milky Way that is about the size of the real Milky Way, we'll get to how big that is later, with no guidance and no direction. After looking through a few menus I didn't understand, I found a mission list on a computer, and not having any better ideas, I decided to pick up whatever sounded easiest, and off I went into space to look for my mission destination. If there's one thing you probably don't need me to say about Elite Dangerous, it's that space looks incredible. This game has good graphics, the ship UI is immersive, there are almost no loading screens even when landing and disembarking, and much of space is portrayed with a realism that makes it feel all the more captivating. In Elite, realism goes further than just looks, however. One of the first things new players might notice about Elite is that space is really, really big. No Man's Sky might have 18 quintillion planets in its universe, but travelling around those planets is made very manageable and nothing takes too long. In Starfield, this is even easier. In Elite, however, if you want to travel a long distance within a star system, it's going to take some time. Your hyperdrive certainly helps, of course, and it can get you to many times faster than the speed of light, which is measured in c in-game. But rather than just jumping to max speed instantly like in No Man's Sky, here you instead gradually increase in speed higher and higher. This means travelling across a large system takes several minutes. My first mission destination wasn't that far away, but I was a bit inexperienced, so it still took me 7 minutes of flying through space to reach the planet's atmosphere, where I was promptly kicked out of hyperdrive, leading to another 5 or 6 minutes of flying much slower to get the rest of the way. Speed and distance are both very real challenges in Elite, and both took me a while to wrap my head around. Remarkably, landing didn't prove too difficult, although I can now see in my footage that I wasn't particularly close to where I was meant to land. Still, nothing wrong with stretching your legs a bit, and this gave me time to enjoy the view. The next problem was that once I reached the settlement where I was meant to make a delivery, I couldn't remember the name of the person I was looking for, and nor did I have any idea how to check. This led me to a much bigger problem of keybinds. There are a lot of various keybinds in this game, many of which are not obvious, and yet rather than being helpful and showing all possible keybinds in a menu like most games, Elite instead seems to nest all of its keybinds into various submenus, making trying to find out what specific buttons do incredibly time-consuming and difficult. Still, after spending a while in this menu, I did finally find the information I was looking for: how to open the quest log, which is by holding down Q if you're wondering. From here I knew who I was looking for, but I still didn't know where they were. I tried to look them up on the computer, but they weren't there. I tried wandering around, but they weren't anywhere. I double-checked the quest log to make sure I was in the right place, double-checked the computer, double-checked my wandering, and so on. Eventually, in desperation, I tried a pro-gamer move, by which I mean I relogged because I thought something might be bugged, and it turns out it was. From there, I found my NPC, picked up or maybe delivered an item, I'm not sure, and that was that. Off I went back to the space station to hand in the quest for my reward. I should say, at this point, I was having a jolly good time. Space is cool. Look how big and empty it is. And I was living out my fantasy. I was heading off into the unknown with no idea what to expect, and even more impressive, I was actually getting somewhere. There is no story in Elite Dangerous. Missions are procedurally generated and feature no real dialogue, and while there is background lore explaining the universe, even that is somewhat hidden. Still, at this point, I was making my own story. I imagined my character as some down-on-his-luck chump who lied on his resume to somehow get handed a ship and a pilot license despite being woefully unqualified for either, who was now faking it until he made it as the commander that everyone seemed to think he was. And boy, was this exciting. After my first mission was such a smashing success, I did what anyone would do and tried my hand at some more missions. And my god, did I not realize just what a fluke my first success had been. I'm not going to go into as much detail for every mission, as that would take too long, so here's the abridged version of what happened next. One thing to keep in mind though is that this game is an always online multiplayer game, meaning you can't manually save to try things out. Instead, you have to live with your consequences, and there can be consequences. On my second mission, I tried to travel through space to my destination just as before, until I ran into a small problem. Actually, it was quite a big problem. At the time, I thought it was a moon, but it turns out I had actually just arrived at the wrong side of the planet to my destination. This led me to crash into the planet while trying to follow the quest marker that said I was still some distance and time away. This caused considerable confusion, and one thing which didn't help me in this situation was how dark everything was. It turns out, something other games don't always make clear is that in space, light is a bit unreliable, and if you end up on the opposite side of a planet to any nearby star, it's fucking dark. Still, an even bigger problem than this was simply learning how to travel from one side of a planet to another, as being in the atmosphere greatly limits your speed, ensuring making this journey within a planet's atmosphere takes hours. What you actually need to do is go some distance directly away from the planet to leave the atmosphere, and then fly around the planet almost perpendicular to the surface before entering the atmosphere at just the right angle. I did not learn how to do this until much later, and I wasted quite a bit of time as a result. This led to my second mission ending up abandoned, but then I had a new problem. How to get back to the space station. Or any space station. On my first return journey, I plotted a course to a destination using the quest log, but now the quest was failed, I couldn't do that. So I ended up lost, trying to manually find a station, which I quickly did, but it wasn't the right kind, and it took quite a few more attempts before I found somewhere with missions again. At this point, I decided maybe I couldn't just fake it until I made it, so I exited the main game to look for more tutorials, which I found. The first of these were the tutorials I had already completed, but then there were several new ones of a completely different style, which makes me think they were added to the game earlier and then replaced by the other tutorials I had already done. Anyway, these tutorials started off well, going back over the basics of space travel and combat, but then the tutorials started to get hard. The mining one went okay until I got to cargo scooping, which I just couldn't get to work until checking a YouTube guide. Yes, I had to check a YouTube guide to work out how to complete a tutorial. That was the situation I was in. Still, if I thought cargo scooping was difficult, the surface vehicle tutorial was on a whole other level, and it was in fact too difficult for me. I still can't complete that tutorial, and I still have no idea how to control this surface vehicle. The controls feel utterly nonsensical to me. The keybinds seem as if they were chosen at random, and I didn't play this game to crash into things in a car. I can do that already in real life. Many other tutorials are simply YouTube videos, which is a bit weird. Maybe they were the original tutorials and there have been 3 different sets of tutorials since the game's release. Regardless, my time spent with these videos and extra tutorials did teach me many things, although remembering everything was a considerable task in itself, as everything has its own keybind. Still, I had learned something useful. At least, I assumed I probably had, somewhere or other, so back I went to missions. My third mission went even worse than the last. Travel took a long time again, but this time when I arrived for my basic delivery job, I was given a fine as soon as I landed for blocking the landing pad, and then everyone at the settlement attacked me. At the time, I had no idea why this was, but I now think maybe I forgot to ask permission to land. You generally have to do that in Elite, and rather than giving me a stern telling off, as would be reasonable, the NPCs just decided it would be quicker or easier to just kill me. I mean, in space, no one can hear you scream, and I guess no one cares if you kill the delivery guy, apparently. Pretty tough job. Anyway, I gave up on that mission, and on the next one decided maybe being a delivery guy isn't for me, and so I just picked up an assassination mission instead. It actually went a lot smoother, and I completed it no problem, but on the next mission, I was fined again for something I didn't understand, and I soon ended up just giving up on missions to instead focus on trying to travel back to the original space station I had started the game on, as maybe I'd have more luck there. This was going well. Traveling between systems is actually easier than traveling through them, as you can just warp jump. At least, I thought it was going well, until I ran out of fuel. Not a big problem, I thought. I can just go to any old space station or settlement to fill up, but then I started to look around the system I was in, and realized, in this system, there were no space stations, or settlements, and that I was completely alone, lost in space with no fuel and nobody to help me. There is actually a player-run organization called the Fuel Rats for just such situations as this. The Fuel Rats provide stranded commanders with fuel free of charge, and they take their job incredibly seriously. In fact, according to their website, they have made over 147,000 rescues with an average success rate of 96.3%. The Fuel Rats don't fuck around, and if this sounds interesting to you, you should check out some other videos about them. I'll link one below, because it's a fascinating subject. At this point, however, I didn't know about any Fuel Rats, but I did know about guns. And so I flew down to the surface of the nearest planet, pulled out my firearm, looked up at that beautiful night sky, so full of distant stars, my temptresses, my sirens, my downfall, and then I did the only thing I could, put the gun to my head and pulled the trigger. Except you can't actually do that in Elite Dangerous, so instead I had to resort to Googling how to end myself, which was a bit of a letdown, kind of killed the vibe I was going for. But I did learn that you can self-destruct your ship, so off I went back out to space, and at long last, finally I was able to do something correctly. And then I woke up in jail, as one does after self-destructing, apparently. At this point, I had several fines, and many more failed missions than successful ones. This felt like an especially good time to give up, but I didn't want to give up. I still had an entire space to explore, and so I tried to take the coward's way out and create a new character for a fresh start, criminal record and fine-free. But apparently you can't do that either, and so in my ever-growing desperation, I turned to the only option I had left: YouTube guides. Maybe the biggest problem Elite Dangerous has is that it's a complicated game that does almost nothing to teach new players about its many complexities. The tutorials you do get are all over the place and leave many things out. You're given no direction in what to do in-game, and when things do go wrong, it's often very hard to understand why or what to do differently. I do not know where my finds came from. I never know where my finds came from. I did nothing wrong. YouTube guides explain a lot more, and I probably should have turned to them sooner, but in my defense, I was often having fun bumbling around on my own, and I was here to explore space. To me, one of the best parts of exploration is working things out for yourself and not knowing what to expect, so I didn't want to turn to outside help unless I really had to. And I think if you want to get anywhere in Elite Dangerous and you're new to the space sim genre, you do have to look for outside help in how to play the game. In fact, if there is one thing almost every guide seems to mention, it's further outside tools. There are multiple wikis for general info, as well as websites dedicated to navigation, and tools that track trading prices or tell you which planets on your path to scan and so on. Basically, outside help is a big part of the game, even for experienced players. Regardless, armed with YouTube assistance, I gave up on missions and went off to try my hand at some other activities, like combat, mining, and most importantly, exploration. Yes, one of the main activities to make money in-game is exploring the galaxy, scanning and probing planets, and potentially even landing on planet surfaces to track down biological or geological features. This still involved plenty of confusion, but thanks to people showing me what to do on YouTube, that confusion didn't last too long, and I was soon following along some tool called the Road to Riches, scanning various planets along the way, which is basically done through 2 fairly simple minigames, while making more money than I knew what to do with. I mean, I did buy a new ship because that seemed a good start, and then I bought some upgrades that I think were improvements, but after that I felt a bit lost again. I could have kept doing what I was doing to make more money, but scanning planets was getting boring, and I'm not that much of a money person. In-game, that is, please subscribe to my Patreon, etc, etc. Still, in-game money didn't mean much to me, and I didn't even want one of the most expensive ships, as that just leads to higher insurance premiums, and sometimes I crash. But that's the thing about YouTube guides. They're incredibly effective at telling new players how to make money, and money I made, but one thing most guides don't seem to prioritize is how to have fun. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I was here to explore space, and everyone knows the best part of space exploration is finding aliens. So off I went to discover life, somewhere out there in the great abyss. This was something I had heard about through YouTube, and it involved a similar process to what I'd already been doing, but this time as I travelled from system to system, I didn't look for valuable planets to scan from the Road to Riches, but instead I looked for planets that had indicators showing they had atmospheres and that they could be landed on. Then, when I found such planets, I flew over to them to probe them, where, eventually, I found signs of life. Now, this was exciting, and so I rushed down to the planet's surface, eager to check what I found, but when I arrived on the surface, I couldn't really see anything, in part because it was fucking dark. So after some unsuccessful searching, I got back in my ship and utilized every bit of space knowledge I had, calling upon all my hours of elite experience to quickly fly around the planet to the day side, something I could actually do by this point. Except that didn't work either, because apparently there was no day side. This planet was so far from any star that it was always pretty dark here. This wasn't ideal, so I decided it was better to search in my ship by flying around, which led to me getting distracted by an artificial structure, which I soon crashed into by going too fast, and so my first discovery of life ended with me killing myself before I ever actually located it. And that's why I never bought a more expensive ship. Anyway, the second attempt went much better, and even though it was still dark, this time I found what I was looking for. Behold, aliens. It's a bacteria. That's pretty cool, right? And if that doesn't impress, well, I found more life on the same planet. Check this out. It's a lime stratus, whatever that is. Actually, that doesn't sound particularly biological now that I think about it, but apparently it is. Very cool. And if anyone is still not impressed, wait until you see my third alien discovery. Now, make sure you're sitting down and ready for this one. Don't be taking a drink. I don't want to be responsible for anyone spitting out liquid over their PC. Right, here we go now. The most alien of all. Mushroom. Now that is cool, come on. Look at it, it's an alien mushroom. Unfortunately, while this first mushroom discovery was genuinely thrilling, from here I kept looking for life, and pretty soon it all started to get quite repetitive. I mean, the first mushroom was awesome, but by the time I had found my fourth planet with mushrooms that looked almost exactly like the first, it just didn't mean anything anymore. Elite Dangerous is a massive game, which means, just like Starfield and No Man's Sky, there is lots of procedural generation. And alien mushroom or not, when you know something is procedurally generated, it feels a bit meaningless. There are actually some more impressive aliens in Elite's world. They're called the Thargoids, and I can only imagine how exciting finding them must be. I've seen footage, and they are a thing to behold, but it's also a rather late game activity, and by this point I was starting to have a problem with Elite Dangerous. Because there were many more interesting things I could potentially do in this game, but the only way to do them, and possibly the only way to even know they exist, is through YouTube guides or other ancillary information. And the only thing I really cared about was exploring space. But if the only way I could achieve that exploration is by constantly checking YouTube guides and wikis and other tools, then it doesn't feel like I'm exploring anything. By that point, there's no mystery. The unknown is revealed before I reach it, and it doesn't provide very satisfying gameplay. And so, I just wasn't sure those interesting remaining activities were worth the time investment to get to them. This is not to say that I didn't enjoy my time with Elite Dangerous. It was, in many ways, a great experience. It just wasn't quite the space exploration experience I was hoping for. It often came close, maybe closer than Starfield or No Man's Sky ever had, but Elite has problems. Its commitment to realism is commendable, but it also introduces plenty of tedium. A lot of its content feels basic and sometimes borderline unfinished. Its procedural generation leads to repetition and can make players' actions lack meaning. The barrier to entry for new players is considerable, and the tutorials don't even come close to being enough. And there's also a distinct lack of direction. Elite Dangerous has added a lot of content over the years, and some of it has been quite poorly received. But I am genuinely surprised that one of the things to be added wasn't a main storyline. Elite is a sandbox game, and I understand and agree that story should not be the main focus. But one well-implemented questline could solve many of the game's problems. It could give players direction so they don't feel as lost initially. It could act as a more intermediate tutorial to introduce more of the game's mechanics and systems gradually and naturally. It could signpost the various content to players so people actually know what their options are. And it could introduce the setting and give players more reason to be invested in Elite's universe. Still, as it stands, this does not seem to be a priority for the developers, and I guess that won't change. There was one final thing I did in this game before I stopped playing, however. Elite accurately recreates the Milky Way on a 1-to-1 scale. This is a pretty staggering achievement, and so before I called it quits, I decided to take a quick trip home to the place where it all began. Unfortunately, after several minutes of system jumping, I realized that you can't actually visit the Sol system. It is there in-game, and it has an interesting description, but it's not visitable. I did check out the surrounding systems, however, like Barnard Star and Alpha Centauri, just to have a quick peek, and in fact, it was through this that I realized that Alpha Centauri was actually a triple star system. I never knew that, which perhaps makes me sound fairly ignorant of space, and to be honest, maybe I am. I'm not really sure how much space knowledge most people have to know how my understanding would compare, but I actually learned a surprising amount from Elite Dangerous. I learned that star systems and orbits are much more diverse than most games make them out to be, and I learned what a parsec is, and that space is fucking dark. And I realized, for the first time in my life, just how big space truly is. Because after failing to reach the Sol system, I decided I wanted to take a trip somewhere else before stopping. But not having anywhere obvious to go, I was drawn to the one place that seemed to stand out. Sagittarius A, the supermassive black hole at the galactic center of the Milky Way. Now, I am fairly ignorant of space, but I'm not that ignorant. So I realized that even with the ability to warp jump between systems, the distance to the center of the galaxy must be a long way, and that reaching it in a short time frame probably wasn't realistic. So I decided I would give myself 1 hour. 1 hour of non-stop jumping towards the galactic center in my recently upgraded spaceship. And then, when 1 hour was up, I would stop and check just how close I came. So that's what I did. This was fairly boring because I was trying to travel efficiently, which meant no stopping to check anything out on the way, but I kept at it, jump after jump after jump, until 1 hour was up. And then I checked my map, comparing where I started to where I reached, and then how much further there was still to go. And that was when it hit me. You often hear how big space is, how big the galaxy is, 100 to 400 billion stars, or how big the universe is, 95 billion light years. But these are just big numbers. Numbers so big that they start to lose shape and become abstract. I can't imagine 100 billion in my head. I can't visualize that many of something. And in many ways, the difference between 100 million or 100 billion or 18 quintillion just doesn't mean much to me. Big numbers are big, and I know that much. I just never knew quite how big. But in Elite Dangerous, space wasn't just a number. It was something I explored. I wandered around, going from system to system, scanning Earth-like planets or looking for signs of life, and this started to create a feeling for just how big these star systems are. And then I stopped looking for anything and just travelled. Jump after jump, system after system, for 1 hour, over 1 hour actually, I lost track of time a little, and I got almost nowhere. The Milky Way has 100 to 400 billion stars. And after years of knowing that, for the first time, that became something I could visualize. Because that is what Elite Dangerous is. And it just seems insanely large. And that is just the Milky Way, one galaxy. The universe contains hundreds of billions of galaxies. And that is something. I'm not sure I'd call Elite a great game, but I'm glad I played it anyway. Still, after spending time with all three of these games, it does start to put things into perspective. Space exploration is difficult. When humanity put a man on the moon in 1969, estimates of when mankind would go beyond this tended to be overly optimistic. In reality though, 2001 brought no space odyssey. The dominant corporations of 2019 are not in the space colony business, and there were still no men on Mars by 2021. Space exploration is difficult, in real life and maybe also in video games. Space is a big, dark, uncaring void that is not designed for the needs or wants of humans or gamers. For developers, this poses a problem, as the more a game adheres to realism in how it handles space, the less suitable space becomes as a setting. Video games are built on action, excitement, convenience, and stories. And so, no matter where you land in Starfield, you're never far from multiple points of interest, and no matter where you go in No Man's Sky, there's always the resources you need to gather. Meanwhile, Elite Dangerous goes some way to embracing the cold reality of space, and it creates an experience that is often slow, complex, punishing, and somewhat anticlimactic as a result, ensuring such games as this will struggle to reach beyond a niche enthusiast audience. Realism is just the start of the space exploration problem, however. The next most obvious challenge is scale. Space is large. Believe me, I've been there. The universe contains a near infinite number of stars, meaning there are a near infinite number of possibilities, and it's these possibilities that often excite us. Developers then want to capture this excitement, and to create a space-themed game without a grand scale doesn't seem to lead to the same hype or fulfill the same fantasy. But scale is hard to achieve. Open world games already seem to struggle at providing players with a whole world while keeping their content fresh, interesting, and believable. Going beyond one world into many only makes this objective harder, and the almost necessary solution of procedural generation often leaves a lot to be desired. Make no mistake, the procedural generation in Starfield, No Man's Sky, and Elite Dangerous is technically very impressive, and it goes some way to creating the necessary illusion. But it's still easy to tell when procedural generation is being used, and knowing this soon brings the illusion down. Alongside scale is the related challenge of delivering the unknown. When you know exactly what's out there, exploration doesn't serve much point, and the massive unknown that space represents is a large part of why we feel such a drive to explore it. But to gamify something often involves making it quantifiable and knowable, and even procedural generation needs to be tightly controlled to not create game-breaking features. I do wonder what Starfield and No Man's Sky would be like if the procedural generation limiters were relaxed to allow for far greater diversity in generations. There would probably be more bugs and jank, but I think personally I might enjoy the results more and be willing to accept the costs. As it stands though, Starfield and No Man's Sky have many planets and many possibilities, but everything in them feels very safe, and through their stories and quest design, the player is often guided a little too much, making discoveries feel a bit lacking. Elite Dangerous instead does try to embrace the unknown of space, just like with realism, with not even any direction or indication of what to do given to players. In reality though, this just leads players to outside sources like third-party tools and YouTube guides, which often reveal too much, spoiling the sense of discovery and putting all the focus on the destination rather than the journey. The final part of the space exploration problem is that it involves multiple different parts, all of which can be hard for developers to implement. Players want to travel through space in a ship, but they also want to land on planet surfaces, interact with alien life, experience the thrill of dogfights, and maybe even more than this. Why not? The possibilities are endless. Space exploration is an evocative fantasy that incorporates many different things, and that makes it a particularly hard fantasy for developers to actually deliver. And a game, or developer, or engine that is good at one thing won't necessarily be good at another. Bethesda's strength is open-world RPGs, so that's what they tried to focus on. The result was many people instead focusing heavily on what Starfield doesn't do, rather than what it does. No Man's Sky amazed with its seamless planetary travel, even at release, but it was a lack of anything else to accompany this that led to so much initial disappointment. And Elite Dangerous has some of the best spaceship flight and combat design around, but its on-foot planetary landing content was added in its most recent expansion pack, Odyssey, and its first-person gameplay is noticeably lacking, while the response from its player base has been largely negative, despite the fact that this is a feature players had been requesting for years. With space, it's easy to want more, and the space exploration fantasy involves many parts, but more isn't always easy to deliver, and the results we end up with often seem to lead to disappointment. And that might actually be one of the big unifiers of space exploration-based games: disappointment. No Man's Sky was once one of the most disappointing games ever released. Elite Dangerous once represented an exciting return to the space sim genre, but its legacy has since become more mixed, with many fans becoming critical of how its post-release development has been handled, and it's a bit early to truly start judging Starfield's legacy, but it certainly seems to have disappointed many people at this current moment in time. Despite this, each of these three games does at least one part of space exploration very well. Starfield is full of fun space stories and adventures. No Man's Sky offers a lot of freedom, all contained in an impressively accessible package, and Elite Dangerous offers a strong sense of realism and immersion. All three games have their strengths, but they all have their weaknesses as well. And for now, that is what space exploration is in video games. You can explore the stars, but maybe not in the way you truly want, and you can't have everything. Space is large, after all, and it doesn't really care much about the wants and needs of gamers. There is one final game that still needs to be mentioned, and you probably know which it is. Star Citizen is not like other games. What started as an ambitious Kickstarter project that failed to meet its initial deadlines has grown exponentially, both in its ambitions and in its failure to meet deadlines. Star Citizen is the most expensive game of all time, and it's still growing. The most recent milestone passed was $600 million in crowdfunding, and as it's still selling ships, some of which are rather expensive, it means funding is still rising. Despite this, the game remains in early alpha, with no release date in sight, and you shouldn't expect that to change anytime soon. Although it is actually playable to backers, and what's available does showcase why this game is taking so long. Star Citizen is the everything game many people have dreamed of, combining all the elements of other games in this video, like story, freedom, realism, immersion, multiplayer, and more, all displayed with cutting-edge graphics in a largely unprecedented recreation of a very incomplete virtual world. Star Citizen's commitment to immersion goes beyond what most would expect, with every action seeming to be fully animated, and all sorts of mundane activities being included, all to create an illusion of a realistic world that you can live a second life in. And this makes it an exciting game that has the potential to deliver on space exploration like never before, but it's also deeply unfinished, and has left a long list of broken promises and disappointed fans in its wake already, which is not bad for a game that hasn't even left alpha yet. And I don't think you can ask for a better representation of gaming's great space exploration dream to end this video on than this. Space exploration is difficult. I don't know what the fate of Star Citizen will be, or when the next big space game will release, but if history is any indication, then by all means dream of going to the stars, but expect some disappointment when you get there. Thank you for watching. If you want to support the creation of these videos, you can by supporting me on Patreon. I don't have much to offer in return, but I would appreciate it. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Maybe I'll even be covering some RPGs. Maybe.